This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Wednesday, the Supreme Court pushed back their decision on the abortion pill Mifepristone until Friday, keeping the country's most popular abortion method available for at least another day, as the court reviews a ruling earlier this month which banned the drug. The Center for Reproductive Rights said the court, quote, should have issued a stay, but instead the court continues to delay any action. In the meantime, abortion providers and their patients across the country have been living in chaos, unclear if they'll still be able to prescribe and access this critical medication, unquote. The Justice Department and drug maker Danco Laboratories warned the court if it does not step in, the supply of the medication could end almost immediately. They say one version of the medication would be considered misbranded, and the generic version would be rendered unapproved. This week, the maker of the generic version of Mifepristone sued the FDA in a bid to keep the drug on the market no matter what the court rules. The original April 7th ruling in the fast-moving case was by the Trump-appointed U.S. District Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk, a longtime abortion opponent and activist. The Supreme Court's orders on Wednesday were issued by Justice Samuel Alito, who also wrote the decision in the Dobbs ruling last year that ended the constitutional right to abortion, overturned Roe v. Wade. For more on all of this and the fight to keep abortion legal and accessible, we're joined by two guests. In Wichita, Kansas, Julie Burkhart is with us. She's president of Wellspring Health Access and co-owner of Hope Clinic. She worked for 8 years with the abortion provider Dr. George Tiller before he was assassinated in church in 2009. Last May, her clinic, which was set to open in just weeks, was firebombed by an anti-abortion arsonist. Her recent piece for Salon is headlined, "I own the only abortion clinic in Wyoming. Post-Roe America is a tragedy and an opportunity." We're also joined by Michele Goodwin, visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School and founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. She hosts the Ms. Magazine podcast on the issues with Michele Goodwin and is the author of Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. Last year, she wrote a guest essay for the New York Times headlined, "I was raped by my father and abortion saved my life." We welcome you both back to Democracy Now! Michele Goodwin, let's begin with you. Start off with what this temporary stay, well, the first one was temporary until this past Wednesday, and now until Friday. What does this stay mean?
Well, this stay could mean that the court is still deliberating. It could mean that there are justices that are drafting dissenting opinions, concurring opinions. We don't know, but it means something more, which is that Mifepristone is still available. It is still available under the conditions that were set by the FDA prior to Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk's opinion. That is the judge in Amarillo, Texas, that decided that Mifepristone should be removed from the marketplace, basically siding with the petitioners who claimed that the drug was rushed to the market and that it was unsafe. It's worth noting, Amy, as you've discussed before, that this is a drug that was under review for 54 months when it was put on the marketplace in 2000. To put that in comparison with other FDA-approved drugs in that same period, they were reviewed for about 15 months. And then secondly, the claims that it is an unsafe drug really is quite unfounded. When the FDA did approve Mifepristone to be in the marketplace, it had already been used in Europe for decades, and we know through decades of research since 2020, or since 2000, excuse me, when it was placed in the marketplace, that it is a drug that has lower morbidities than Tylenol, than Viagra, than penicillin. So we don't know what the Supreme Court will do on Friday, but one more point with this is that there are over 200 drug manufacturers that have signed a letter expressing their deep concern about the ruling that came out of Amarillo, Texas, because it could affect more than just Mifepristone and drugs related to reproductive health. It could be virtually any drug that is petitioned to be removed from the U.S. marketplace.
So, Michele Goodwin, talk about Samuel Alito and his role. I mean, this came under his jurisdiction, but Justice Alito is well known as the man who is the author of the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade. So what it means that he was the original person who extended the stay and now has done it again.
Well, it's hard to read the tea leaves with that, but you make an excellent point, which is that Justice Alito authored the decision in Dobbs, that June 24th, 2022 decision just less than a year ago that overturned Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey. Planned Parenthood v. Casey was a 1992 decision, and Roe v. Wade 1973. So we're talking about decades of precedent, then rendered virtually meaningless through the Dobbs decision. You know, it's worth noting that the Dobbs decision was a case that came out of the state of Mississippi, where there had only been one abortion clinic. And in that state, if you're a black woman, you're 118 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. But Justice Alito's opinions in this domain must also be linked to the Burwell v. Hobby Lobby decision, which is one that challenged the mandate through the Affordable Care Act that contraceptives would be available. And Justice Alito authored that decision too, which basically meant that employers who claim some religious objection to contraception could deny that to their female employees. So we see a trajectory of cases with Justice Alito that side against reproductive health rights and justice, but we don't know exactly what the court will do in this particular case, particularly given that drug manufacturers have spoken out. And one last point is that in the Dobbs decision, the court said that these matters would be returned to the states, that the laboratories of democracy are in the states, and that if people want access to abortion, then that's the place in which these issues should be settled. By Judge Kaczmarek's order, that basically flies in the face of the Dobbs decision, meaning that if his order were allowed to stand in states like California, Illinois, New York, Mifepristone would no longer be available for this use, therefore making hash of what the Supreme Court issued just last year.
Michele Goodwin, what do you think of Congress members like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, saying that the Biden administration should simply ignore this ruling? What are the grounds for this?
Well, you know, right now, she's not alone. There are also doctors that are articulating just how distressing this happens to be. So if we set the ground a bit more, which I think is really important, the United States is the deadliest place in all of the industrialized world to be pregnant. It's alarming, and I know for many Americans that is shocking, but we rank somewhere around 55th in the world in terms of maternal safety. That is, it's far safer to be pregnant and to have a child with dignity in countries that have been recently war-torn. In the United States, the Supreme Court conceded in 2016 in a case, Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt, that a woman is 14 times more likely in the United States to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. So what does this then mean for doctors, not just AOC? For doctors in states across the country now that have banned abortion, they face, such as in Texas, 99 years incarceration, $100,000 in fines, losing their medical license to practice if, in fact, they are found to have tried to save a woman's life at a point before she was very, very close to death. And this is relating to a lawsuit that is right now in the state of Texas, brought by 5 women who were not necessarily pro-choice. In fact, some articulated anti-abortion views, but it turned out that they would need abortions to save their lives. And in times that were most critical, with sepsis setting in, with one woman gestating twins, but one of the twins dying, and that causing health effects for her and also the other fetus. In those instances, doctors in Texas felt that they were handcuffed, that they could not respond to the urgent needs of their patients. And so what we hear from doctors, what we hear from AOC is that something must be done now. This is a time that is much like Jim Crow. It is a new Jane Crow in the United States, where there are free states and there are those where people no longer have access to bodily autonomy.
You have now the leading pharmaceutical companies in this country signing a letter talking about the danger to not just Mifepristone, but to all drugs. And the idea that a judge is overruling scientists at the FDA. Michele, Professor Goodwin.
Yes. Well, that is a very deep concern and worry. Let's be clear, we're still in a pandemic, but note that over the last 3 years now, there have been people who have denied that there is such a thing as COVID, that there is a pandemic. There are people who have been pressing that COVID vaccines be taken out of the marketplace. There are people who have moral opposition to vaccines. There are parents who do not want to vaccinate their children against smallpox. You can imagine that those types of individuals could also then petition a judge that they select, that they know might have similar views, and petition that judge in order for those types of drugs to be removed from the marketplace as well. Now, years ago, that might have seemed to be something extreme and that would never happen in the United States. But we're in a critically unusual time where a case such as this has now reached the Supreme Court. And what that does mean is the potential for other kinds of petitioners to come forward who are against other prescription medications. And in some ways, when you look at the Burwell v. Hobby Lobby decision, there is an aspect of that that has already been visited by the Supreme Court.
I want to bring Julie Burkhart into this conversation. She is president of Wellspring Health Access and co-owner of Hope Clinic. She worked with Dr. George Tiller, as I said earlier, who was assassinated in church, well-known abortion provider in Wichita. Julie, just respond, if you could start off by talking about the state of abortion access in this country and your concerns about what the Supreme Court will rule, and how it affects your practice and pregnant people all over the country.
Yes, thank you, and good morning. Well, we have seen with my work in both Illinois and in the state of Wyoming, which are two very different states, one where we have legal protections in Illinois, and in Wyoming where we have been in litigation and battling the state so that people can maintain their bodily autonomy. We see primarily in Illinois, we've had an uptick. We're seeing over 800 patients monthly now. Our patient volume continues to increase, has been increasing after the fall of Roe in June of 22. We see primarily our patients coming from states that have now banned abortion care. So Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, any of the states that you see surrounding that sea of blue, which is now Illinois. We also see that 50% to more than 50% of our patients, which is in line with the national numbers that we see for medication abortion, those patients who are coming to us are requesting to terminate a pregnancy via Mifepristone and misoprostol.
Can you talk about the clinics that you run? Can you talk about what happened in Wyoming and where you are in Wichita, where George Tiller died?
Yes. I will start off with Wyoming. We were set to open our doors in June, actually June 14th of 22, just 10 days before the court ruled. However, in late May of last year, we had an anti-choice arsonist set our clinic on fire. And so we have spent these past months rebuilding the clinic, and we are hopeful that we'll be able to open our doors next week. It's been quite a trek. We have, law enforcement has apprehended the arsonist just a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, it was a 22-year-old Casper, Wyoming woman, Lorna Green, who decided that abortion was disturbing to her, she stated in an affidavit, and decided to set our clinic ablaze. But we did not want to let that deter us. People in every part of this country deserve to have access to reproductive health care and to make their own decisions and determinations about their bodies. And so we decided that we would dig our heels in even further in Wyoming and make sure that people have access to abortion care.
I mean, my God, Julie Burkhart, you're a certified nurse practitioner. Your Wyoming clinic was bombed, was set fire to. The clinic in Wichita, well, George Tiller, the man you worked with for years, was murdered. Explain your bravery, why you continue. This is extremely real to you, not to mention what happens to women who are under extreme duress and or pregnant people who say they need to have an abortion.
Well, sometimes I just don't know how to answer that question. I just have a very deep conviction and feel that if we are living in the United States, people deserve everywhere, and no matter who you are, deserve access to quality health care, amongst other things. And people must be able to make their own decisions about their own bodies. So it doesn't matter whether you're, living in New York or California or Wyoming or Oklahoma or Kentucky, people everywhere must have the ability to make decisions about their own lives. Otherwise, I don't feel that what we stand for in the United States then really exemplifies that intent of having true freedom for everyone in this country.
Let me ask you something. The woman who was charged in Wyoming who set fire to your clinic, she wasn't charged with domestic terrorism?
Well, she is being, and the case is still in process. There is supposed to be a grand jury hearing, I've been told, next month. I have not heard back yet from prosecutors. She is going to be charged under FACE, and I'm not sure what the other charges are at this time. I do know that the penalty carries 5 to 25 years, I believe, in prison.
Also, Mifepristone is part of a 2-drug regimen. The second is misoprostol. Now, if Mifepristone, if people can't get it, they can use the second drug. It's not quite as effective, and it has more side effects. Is that right? So people who are pregnant will be endangered. by simply having the second drug, though if you can talk about that, what this ruling means.
Well, and this is where it's been such a, we have just been in limbo. It's been a ping pong effect. Regimens regarding medication abortion were changed after Roe fell back in June because of people coming from banned states over to legal states and not wanting to put patients or physicians in a precarious situation going back to a banned state. So here we are in a different situation with medication abortion, where we're looking at potentially providing a misoprostol-only regimen for our patients. And it's concerning because we want to continue to ensure that patients, if they need abortion care and they're coming from banned states, if they can get to a clinic in a state where it's legal, that they are not going to go back to their home state and being prosecuted by overzealous attorneys in those states. So we have protocols in place that we will use if we need to, but it is definitely going to put a burden and a hardship on those patients. And we suspect that more people might opt for procedural abortions than medication abortions at that point, but we will see. And, this also makes it harder, especially for people who are getting medication abortion in the mail, who are in states where it is illegal or going back to a state where it's illegal. This makes it that much harder on those people who need access to good quality health care.
I want to end with Michele Goodwin. You now have a situation, even without this ruling, where abortion is illegal basically in something like, more than a dozen states, in 13 states, following the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade last year. Georgia also bans abortion at about 6 weeks of pregnancy, before many know that they're pregnant. Florida now the same. We are talking about situations where even in the case of rape and incest, if you can talk about what this means for people across this country and take it back to Kaczmarek's decision, a well-known anti-abortion activist before he became a federal judge under Trump in Texas. And now turns out that he erased his name from a journal piece he had written against abortion when he was being considered by the Senate. And the language he used in his decision both talked about unborn humans, and this is being repeated in further decisions, and referred to the Comstock Act. If you can summarize for us where this country is headed in a legal direction, and then when this is considered in referenda across the country, when people at the grassroots have a choice to decide the direction they go in.
Well, it's a dangerous decision. There's so much that we could talk about with this, in that if you think about Roe v. Wade, a 7-2 opinion, 5 of those 7 justices were Republican appointed. Justice Blackmun, who wrote the opinion in Roe, was put on the court by Richard Nixon. Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, was the treasurer of Planned Parenthood. This gives you some sense of just the wide gap and distance between where we began and where we are now. In Roe v. Wade, to your point with regard to language, in Roe v. Wade, the court said that there is a potential life during a pregnancy. And that's right, because not all pregnancies will end in birth. About 15 to 20% will end in miscarriage or stillbirth. And the language now that we see coming out of the Kaczmarek ruling, using that language of unborn human child, and then writing in footnotes the preference for using this, that this is the accurate terminology to be used in such cases, really stretches medicine and science, because it's just simply not accurate to consistently what had been in American law, and also gives the perception that all pregnancies necessarily end in birth, which they simply do not. That also has ramifications then when we think about civil punishments and criminal punishments as well. We right now have in South Carolina lawmakers that are pushing forward a bill that would call for the death penalty against women who have abortions and people with the capacity for pregnancy who have abortions. There is this false sense that all pregnancies will necessarily end in a birth, and if that is interrupted in any way, then the state can criminally punish and also impose civil fines. But when you mention that there are more than a dozen states that are now in this position, if we took a map and we looked at the map of the Confederacy, of American slavery, of Jim Crow, you would find that it fits quite well over the map that is now anti-abortion. And there's something to be said about those states that were never beacons of freedom for women or people of color or Black people particularly. And they are not beacons of hope of freedom now for Black women and for people with the capacity for pregnancy in those states. And we've paid far too little attention in drawing that line. And if we draw that line from history into the present, then there are certain things that we do know. And that is, save for federal interventions, either through the Supreme Court, Congress, or executive order, these are places that have never tried to be accountable and to create remedy for the past horrors that were inflicted during slavery and during Jim Crow. To bring it all back to Dobbs, that decision that shows great solicitude to the state of Mississippi. The state of Mississippi claimed that it needed this abortion ban in order to protect the health and safety of women. Nothing could be really further than the truth. But if we think about this, it wasn't until 2013 that the state of Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment, Amy. The 13th Amendment was that amendment which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, one that was ratified in 1865, but it took until 2013 for Mississippi to get there. And Mississippi is still working, and many of these other states, on that long arc to freedom. They're not quite there, and certainly the backdrop of where they are with regard to abortion bans shows how far away they are from recognizing the human dignity and the personhood of people with the capacity for pregnancy in their states.
Well, Michele Goodwin, we want to thank you for being with us. Of course, we'll continue to cover this issue. The stay has been put in place until Friday, until tomorrow. Michele Goodwin is visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School, author of Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. And thank you to Julie Burkhart in Wichita, Kansas, president of Wellspring Health Access, co-owner of Hope Clinic. She worked with Dr. George Tiller for years.